For more than half a century, Vince McMahon built an empire that, before him, no one believed could even exist, turning wrestling from dusty local arenas into a global entertainment industry where WrestleMania is no longer just a sporting event, but a cultural ritual of modern America, where tens of thousands of fans rise to their feet together, cheer together, and believe they're witnessing something bigger than themselves. He was the one who dared to break every old boundary, dared to challenge traditional territories, dared to take WWE out of its comfort zone onto national cable television, and then reach more than 100 countries around the world, creating mainstream icons, characters that stepped beyond the ring to become part of our collective memory. Under his hand, wrestling stopped being a sideshow entertainment and became sports entertainment, a new language that fused athletics, drama, and raw emotion, where absolute creative power was concentrated in the hands of a single individual. Vince McMahon's achievements aren't just measured in money, power, or fame, but in how he forced an entire industry to breathe to his rhythm, forced the world to see wrestling through different eyes, and for many decades, no one could deny that he was the very center of the storm called WWE. But right there, in what seemed like absolute glory, a silent pain stretched on for 30 years, because to keep that empire from collapsing, Vince McMahon had to live two parallel lives. One, public life of power, control, and no compromise, and another hidden life where the fear of being abandoned never let go. His will wasn't forged from victories, but from a deep, haunting obsession that if he ever stopped, if he ever walked away, everyone would turn their backs, just like what he experienced as an unprotected child. So, he never allowed himself weakness, never allowed himself retreat, never allowed himself to live as an ordinary human being. Instead, he split himself in two to survive. One half, standing under the lights, straining to be the ruler. The other half, enduring in silence, carrying a loneliness no one could see. And it was in that very tearing between monumental achievement and wordless pain that Vince McMahon kept walking forward. Not because he didn't know exhaustion, but because he never learned how to step out of the ring without feeling like he was being left behind. If you want to keep following the stories behind the spotlight of the people who shaped modern America, please hit subscribe so you don't miss the next part where the real life of Vince McMahon finally begins to be revealed. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next part where things that have never been spoken will gradually come to light. Vince McMahon's childhood had no clear starting point of happiness, but was instead a long stretch of days filled with tension and fear, where a child grew up never knowing for sure what he would have to endure the next day. In the house he was forced to call home, his stepfather was not present as a protector, but as a constant threat, a shadow always looming behind every small movement. The beatings were not just meant to punish, but served as a way to assert power, making a child understand that he had no voice, no right to resist, and certainly no safety net. The threats, the sudden outbursts of rage, the looks that made the other person shrink, these taught Vince very early that safety was not a given, but something that could be taken away at any moment. No one stepped in to shield him, no one asked questions, no one explained that what was happening was wrong. In the complete absence of protection and empathy, Vince had to find his own way to survive, like a child learning to hold his breath underwater so he wouldn't be swept away. Each passing day became a wordless lesson in silence. Crying did not bring mercy. It only made the violence crueler. Begging did not open an escape. It only made the stronger one feel more entitled to trample him. Trust did not lead to safety. It became a trap that deepened the pain. And so, very early on, Vince learned to lock his emotions away tightly, learned to stand still, learned to watch and anticipate the adult's anger, learned to survive without drawing attention. A child who had not yet had time to understand what love was, had to first understand what fear was. and that fear did not explode violently, but seeped in slowly, deeply, becoming a permanent state of mind. In that world, there was no room for weakness, because weakness meant being hurt again. It was in that very circumstance that Vince formed his first life principles, not taught through words, but etched deeply through painful experience. Do not cry, because tears save no one. Do not beg, because pleading only reveals helplessness. Do not trust anyone, because trust always comes at too high a price. Those principles did not disappear as he grew up. They became the foundation for the entire person he would later become. The double life did not emerge as a power strategy, but as a survival reflex that had taken shape in childhood. On the outside, Vince trained himself to be hard, closed off, showing no emotion. On the inside, the fear of abandonment remained coiled tight, but was never allowed to surface. Those two worlds existed side by side, one world for facing others, and one world for locking himself away, where the pain had no audience and no escape. The absence of protection in those early years left Vince growing up with the feeling that his own presence was never guaranteed, that any relationship could vanish if he was not strong enough. The feeling of being abandoned did not come from a single event, but accumulated through every day when no one intervened, through every moment of violence that took place in silence. And it was that very feeling that turned into a lifelong obsession, an obsession that drove him to always be in the position of control, to always be the one making the decisions, to always stand above, so he would never be pushed down again. For Vince, power was not just ambition. It was the substitute for the safety he had never had. Control was not just a way to run things. It was a way to keep the fear from rising to the surface. In the young mind of the boy from back then, the world was divided into two kinds of people, those with power and those who had to endure. And Vince swore to himself that he would never belong to the second group again. That oath was never spoken out loud, but it followed him through every stage of growing up, through every major and minor decision. It explains why he never allowed himself rest, why he never trusted delegating power, why he always suspected anything that could take his position away. From very early on, he equated letting go with being abandoned, and that fear became the silent engine driving every action. Those childhood years did not end when Vince left the house of violence. They continued living inside him as a wordless memory. It is present in the way he sees the world as an arena, where the one who stands firm is the one who shows no weakness. It is present in the way he keeps distance from people, in the way he builds relationships based on roles and authority rather than sharing. It is present in the iron will that helped him overcome adversity, but also in the loneliness he has never escaped. Vince McMahon grew up, became strong, became powerful, but the child who learned fear before he ever learned love is still there, quietly controlling every reflex, every decision, every ceaseless effort to make sure he never has to feel abandoned one more time. At the age of 12, when most other children were still carefree, chasing very small concerns, Vince McMahon met his biological father for the first time. A meeting that should have brought some compensation for the years of absence, but in the end, only carved the unfillable void even deeper. That meeting had no hug, no apology for the lost years, no gentleness to mend a childhood that had been torn apart too early. The man standing in front of Vince was not the image of protection he had vaguely imagined, but a distant, stern figure belonging to another world where emotions were suppressed and strength was considered the only measure of worth. For a child who had grown up amid violence and silence, that meeting did not bring the feeling of being found. It only confirmed one more painful truth. Even his own biological father could not give back to him what he had never had. There was no moment of reunion to mark a fresh start, only the cold reality that what had been lost would never come back. Vince understood that his childhood had passed without anyone able to restore it. that no compensation could ever heal the years he had to teach himself how to survive. And it was precisely in that emotional void that wrestling entered his life, not as mere entertainment, but as a new system of order, a world with clear rules where the strong are not abandoned and the weak must endure in silence. Wrestling does not ask where you come from, does not care what you have lost. It only looks at whether you have the strength to stand firm. For Vince, that was a world far easier to understand than family, because their power is open, dominance is acknowledged, and no one pretends to love when the reality is only distance. Under the dim lights of the arenas, Vince saw a logic he could grasp. If you are strong enough, you will not be left behind. If you can control the match, you will not be pushed to the sidelines. From very early on, he began equating power with safety, seeing standing at the very top as the only way to never return to the helplessness of a child who had once been left to fend for himself. Wrestling became the language he understood perfectly, because it did not demand trust, only strength and decisiveness. There, no one asked about old wounds, but no one could deny the position of the winner either. For a child who had never been protected, that feeling brought a kind of safety he had never known before. The meeting with his biological father did not open an emotional door. It closed off the last remnants of childhood. Vince stopped expecting protection from others and transferred all expectations onto himself. He learned to observe, learned to anticipate the intentions of those around him, learned not to let anyone get too close. A child gradually disappeared, replaced by a person always on guard, always ready to defend, always prepared for the possibility of being abandoned once more. In his mind, the world was divided into clear positions, those who hold power and those who are dependent, and Vince decided he would never belong to the second group again. From that moment on, every relationship was viewed through the lens of control and distance. Family was no longer a place to seek comfort, but a structure where each person kept their own position. No intrusion, no sharing too much. Wrestling, on the other hand, gave Vince a sense of belonging, even if it was a cold belonging based on power rather than emotion. He did not find love there, but he found certainty, and for him, certainty was worth more than anything else. Looking back, it is clear that the meeting with his biological father at the age of 12 truly marked the moment when Vince McMahon lost the very last piece of his childhood. Not because he was openly rejected, but because he understood that no one was coming to save him, that any compensation was already far too late. From then on, he no longer lived as a child learning how to love, but as a person learning how to survive in a world he believed only respected strength. A child vanished quietly, and in his place stood someone always vigilant, always ready to build the armor of power to shield himself from the fear of abandonment that had followed him since those earliest years. The decision to buy the company from his biological father did not come to Vince McMahon as a moment of triumph or a smooth continuation of a family legacy, but as a survival reflex pushed to its absolute limit. For him, it was not an act of inheritance, much less a warm father-to-son story. It was the only way to end the constant feeling of standing on the sidelines, always at risk of being pushed out at any moment. In Vince's mind, buying the company meant gripping tightly to his own right to exist, affirming to himself that he was no longer the child who had to wait for others to decide his fate. He was not buying a business. He was buying certainty, buying the right to stay, buying the feeling that no one could ever take his position away again. That moment carried a cold determination. No one would ever look down on him again. No one would treat him like a shadow. No relationship would ever put him in a position of weakness. The years of being abandoned had taught him that power is never given for free, and if he did not seize it himself, it would never belong to him. So, Vince stepped into the role of leader with a mindset that was both fierce and lonely, like someone far too accustomed to relying only on himself. He did not seek consensus. because consensus meant having to share control. He did not seek understanding, because understanding always came with the risk of being hurt. Instead, he built a structure where everything operated according to his will, where order was placed above emotion, where loyalty was measured by the ability to obey. At the same time, a quiet process of isolation began. Vince did not notice it right away, or perhaps he did notice, but accepted it as the price he had to pay. Every decision that tightened his grip on power was one step back from the people around him. Every time he chose control over trust, a new wall went up. Family, which should have been a refuge after years of insecurity, gradually became just another part of the system he was running. Relationships were no longer nurtured through sharing, but through roles and responsibilities. Work conversations overtook private moments. Cold operating principles seeped into family life, turning it into a stable structure, but one lacking warmth. Vince believed that if he kept everything under control, no one could abandon him again. But that very belief pushed him into deeper isolation. He began living in a world where every relationship was filtered through the lens of power, where closeness was seen as weakness, and where showing emotion was considered dangerous. Family was no longer a place where he could lay down his burdens. It became another part of the machine that needed to be kept in order. The people closest to him were still there in form, but the invisible distance grew wider, filled by packed schedules, unilateral decisions, and prolonged silence. In the process of building the empire, Vince grew accustomed to standing alone at the very top. He convinced himself that loneliness was a sign of strength, that only the weak needed to rely on others. But deep down, the old fear still smoldered, not disappearing but simply changing shape. Instead of fearing beatings or threats, he feared losing control, feared being sidelined, feared the feeling of invisibility that had haunted his childhood returning. And to escape that fear, he kept building higher, thicker walls, even when that meant cutting himself off from the relationships that could have brought comfort. In the end, buying the company did not bring the sense of belonging Vince had once hoped for. It brought power, brought an undeniable position, but it did not bring inner safety. He stood at the center of a structure he had created himself, yet he did not know where to turn when exhausted. Family was there, but no longer a refuge. Work was there, but never allowed him rest. And it was in that very paradox that the tragedy of Vince McMahon began to take clearer shape. To avoid being abandoned, he isolated himself. To belong, he turned every relationship into a system. From that point on, his life entered an orbit that was not easy to reverse. Power brought outward certainty, but at the same time drained the spaces where he could simply be himself. With each passing day, Vince became more essential to his empire and more distant from the simple connections he had never truly had the chance to experience. He did not see it as a tragedy, because for him, tragedy always meant weakness. He only saw one path to survival: keep controlling, keep standing firm, keep proving that he could not be replaced. And it was that choice made out of the fear of being pushed aside that laid the foundation for a life where belonging was always bought with power, never coming from protection or love. WrestleMania was born and exploded in a way that even the most skeptical people could not deny, transforming Vince McMahon from a daring promoter into the man standing at the center of an unprecedented cultural phenomenon in the history of American wrestling. Packed stadiums, skyrocketing television numbers, sponsorship deals appearing one after another, all of it created the feeling that Vince had finally reached what he had pursued since his teenage years, a position where no one could push him aside. WWE was no longer a regional entertainment company. It became an empire, expanding at breakneck speed, reaching nationwide and then worldwide, broadcasting on cable television, international networks, infiltrating mainstream American life in a way no competitor could match. On the surface, it was a story of vision, of boldness, of a man who dared to bet everything and won big. But beneath that dazzling spotlight, success did not bring Vince the sense of safety he had once imagined. The higher he climbed, the less he slept. Long nights in the office followed one after another. Constant flights. Schedules with no gaps. All of it, not because he was romantically passionate about the work, but because he did not dare stop. Resting meant handing control over to someone else, and that awakened in him the deepest fear. The fear of being replaced, forgotten, pushed to the sidelines, just like in those early years. Vince did not believe in the concept of succession, because in his mind, a successor always carried the risk of betrayal or failure. He saw in every potential employee not just the ability to lighten his load, but the potential to take away the position he had traded his entire childhood and personal life to secure. The expansion of WWE did not bring relief. It brought heavier and heavier pressure. Every success opened a new front that needed control, a new system that needed oversight, a new worry that just one small mistake could bring everything crashing down. Vince lived in a state of constant alertness, where victory was never an ending, but only a comma before the next battle. He did not allow himself to enjoy moments of glory, because enjoying them meant letting go, and letting go was something he had never learned to accept. Success came to him like a wave that swept away every empty space, filling every second with responsibility and anxiety, making him drift further and further from the peace he thought he was seeking. The more he controlled, the more fragile the world around him seemed. He began to suspect that if he did not personally intervene in every detail, everything would slip from his grasp. Trust, already fragile since childhood, nearly vanished completely during this period. He trusted the system he had built, but he did not trust the people operating it. That forced him to shoulder everything himself, from the biggest decisions to the smallest details, as if looking away from the big picture for even a moment would cost him everything he had created. The bigger WWE grew, the more Vince shrank into a world where he was the sole center, where every line led back to one point, and that point was never allowed to fall asleep. Success did not bring peace, because peace requires trust, and trust was something Vince had never truly possessed. The years of abandonment had taught him that safety does not come from sharing, but from absolute control. So, when WWE became a colossal machine, he did not feel relieved. He felt the burden of keeping that machine from ever stopping. Every sleepless night was a night he reminded himself that one slip-up and everyone would turn their backs. Every decision to keep going without rest was a way to postpone the fear that one day the world he dominated would no longer need him. The fear of losing everything did not diminish with success. It swelled with every step of expansion. Vince saw in each new peak not just opportunity, but the risk of a collapse from an even greater height. And the higher he stood, the more painful the imagined fall became. That kept him living in a suffocating state, where every achievement came with a heavier and heavier psychological price. He did not allow himself to believe he was enough, because enough was a concept for people who could stop and stopping. For him, always meant being abandoned. In the world Vince created, success became an inescapable loop. It sustained him with power and recognition, but at the same time drained his ability to feel inner safety. He did not know how to stand still and look back, did not know how to delegate without feeling anxious, did not know how to sleep a full night without fearing that tomorrow everything would change. The bigger WWE grew, the smaller Vince became in his own private world, where the worry of losing it all overshadowed every joy of victory. And it was in that very paradox that the tragedy of success gradually became clear. WrestleMania, WWE. The record numbers and public acclaim did not heal the old wounds. They only covered them with the frantic pace of work. Success did not give Vince a sense of belonging. It only made him more afraid of losing what he had just grasped. He kept moving forward, kept expanding, kept straining against the constant worry that everything could vanish. And in that endless race, Vince McMahon did not find peace. He only found more reasons to never stop, as if slowing down even one step would allow the darkness of abandonment to drag him back to the deepest fears that had followed him since childhood. When WWE entered the irreversible phase of expansion, Vince McMahon realized that backstage power was still not enough to protect him from his deepest fear: being disrespected, challenged, exposed in front of the public. And so, Mr. McMahon was born not as a purely entertaining idea, but as a mask forged from wounds that had never healed. On screen, he became the ruthless, tyrannical boss, the one the audience booed, hated, and mocked. But it was precisely in that booing that Vince found a paradoxical safety. If they mocked him for things he deliberately exposed, they could not humiliate him with the things he feared most. If he turned himself into the villain, he no longer had to worry about someone else unmasking him. Mr. McMahon was the place where Vince could do the things his real self would never allow. There, he could be ruthless without apology, humiliate others before they could humiliate him, unleash pent-up aggression as a long-suppressed release of pressure. The audience thought they were watching an exaggerated performance, a larger-than-life character designed for television drama. But for Vince, it was the first time he could stand before the world and speak the things he had kept inside since childhood, even if in a distorted and extreme form. Every biting line, every domineering action on screen was a way for him to affirm that this time he was the one controlling the game, not the passive child in the face of violence and abandonment. The public booed, but Vince did not feel pain. On the contrary, it felt familiar. Booing was something he had learned to endure very early on, and when it came according to his script, it became more bearable. Mocking laughter was no longer a threat, but proof that he was one step ahead. Mr. McMahon allowed him to turn hatred into an asset, to turn attacks into fuel for his power. In that world, no one could hurt him with words, because he had already done it to himself first. And that very proactivity gave him a false sense of safety that his real self had never known. But the price began to show itself very quickly. The double life, which had existed quietly since childhood, now became a sealed psychological prison. Vince did not just play Mr. McMahon in front of the cameras. He gradually carried that personality out of the studio. The line between the role and the real person blurred until it was hard to distinguish. The ruthlessness that was once confined to the script began to affect the way he viewed the people around him. He grew accustomed to giving orders, to testing loyalty, to using fear as a management tool. What started as a protective mask slowly became a second skin, tightening around him even when the cameras were off. Vince began to find it difficult to return to a normal state. When the booing stopped, when there was no role to hide behind, he faced the emptiness that Mr. McMahon had once helped him conceal. Instead of liberation, the second personality made him dependent. Every appearance as Mr. McMahon was a moment he could exist without fear of being hurt, but also a moment he sank deeper into the loop of control and isolation. He no longer knew which feelings were real and which were learned reflexes. He could no longer tell which was necessary power for running the company and which was cruelty born from old fears. The people around him gradually noticed the change, but few dared to name it. Mr. McMahon had become too powerful an icon to be questioned, and Vince, at the very top, had no one close enough to remind him that the role was swallowing the real person. His family watched a husband and father grow more distant, not because he did not care, but because he did not know how to exist outside the armor that had saved him for so long. Moments of softness became rare, and when they appeared, he immediately extinguished them, as if afraid that letting go even a little would cause everything to collapse. The double life was no longer a flexible survival tool. It had become a rigid structure, locking him in the middle. On one side was the public Vince McMahon, who could never be allowed to show weakness. On the other was Mr. McMahon, where he shed all restraint. But between those two people, there was no longer any space for him to breathe. He could not go back to being the child who needed protection, and he could not remain forever the emotionless villain. That fragmentation created a simmering, prolonged tension, keeping him in a constant state of defense even against himself. The more attached he became to Mr. McMahon, the harder it was to leave the role. He began to believe that was the only way to hold on to power, the only way to prevent the world from hurting him. But he also began to pay the price with deeper loneliness, with the loss of the ability to connect genuinely. Relationships became shallow, maintained by roles and authority rather than trust. He lived among crowds, but could not touch anyone, because the mask he had created was too thick to allow closeness. Mr. McMahon was born to shield him, but gradually became the monster Vince had to hide behind, a monster that helped him stand firm before the world, but also imprisoned him in the very fear that had given it life. With no clear boundary left between the role and the person, Vince McMahon stepped deeper into his personal tragedy, where survival was achieved by splitting himself in two, and the price was never being able to be a whole person again. The marriage between Vince McMahon and Linda McMahon did not collapse in the loud way the public usually imagines. No public affair scandals, no fights exposed to the media, no explosive moment that led to a breakup, but instead endured persistently like a structure that stands firm yet rigid, where two people stayed side by side for decades but rarely truly touched each other. Linda was always there, next to Vince from the early days of poverty, from when WWE was still a reckless gamble, from before he became the symbol of power for an entire industry. But that presence carried the shape of duty more than sharing, of obligation more than an emotional refuge. Vince did not lack a companion, but he lacked a safe space where he could be vulnerable, and that very fact shaped their entire married life. Linda understood Vince in the way of someone who built a career alongside him, who shouldered a colossal machine that never stopped running. She stood beside him as partner, director, manager, spokesperson, but very rarely was she allowed to step into the inner world that Vince had locked tight since childhood. For him, marriage was not a place to shed the armor, but another part of the system that needed to be kept stable. He brought into the family the same principles he imposed at work: discipline, control, order. Conversations about plans, strategies, and responsibilities gradually overtook simple questions about feelings. Not because Vince did not care, but because he did not know how to care in a softer way. Their marriage operated on duty, because duty was what Vince understood best. Duty does not demand vulnerability, does not put him in a position of easy hurt. Duty allowed him to stay without having to open up. In that structure, Linda became the one who kept balance for a man who always lived in a state of tension. She was the practical anchor, but not the place where Vince could lay down his fears. The two of them shared one life, yet carried parallel inner worlds that rarely intersected. Vince escaped into work to avoid emotions. Linda carried the rest to keep the family from falling apart. That distance did not arrive in a single day, but accumulated over the years, as Vince was increasingly swallowed by power and the obsession with control. Every time he chose work over coming home, every time he chose decision over listening, an invisible gap widened further. Linda was still there, but her presence gradually became quieter, more like part of the background than someone who could step into the emotional center of his life. Vince was not accustomed to sharing worries, because sharing meant admitting he did not control everything, and in his world, that was unacceptable. Two people living parallel lives within the same marriage, looking in the same direction but from two different positions. Vince lived under the pressure of maintaining power. Linda lived under the pressure of maintaining stability. He fought the fear of abandonment by gripping everything tightly. She fought reality by becoming resilient and patient. They did not lack respect for each other, but that respect was not enough to replace emotional closeness. The rare quiet moments were not when they shared their hearts, but when both were silent, each pursuing their own thoughts. For many years, this marriage existed as an unspoken agreement. Vince continued building the empire. Linda continued keeping everything from collapsing. It was a fragile but effective balance, until the mental toll became too great. Vince withdrew more and more. Linda had to step in for him in more and more roles, not just at work, but in family life too. And that very substitution, though necessary, only reinforced the distance between them. Vince grew used to not having to face difficult emotions directly. Linda grew used to carrying the load in silence. Their marriage did not fail in the traditional sense, but it also did not flourish. It survived, but was not nurtured. It existed, but did not heal. And in that existence, Vince continued to reinforce his double life, where he was the husband in name, the partner in business, but still a solitary man in his heart. Linda was beside him, but never reached the deepest part of him, the part still trapped in childhood fears. They walked through decades together, witnessed success, power, and fame together, but the gap between their inner worlds never narrowed. In the end, the tragedy of this marriage was not that they did not love each other, but that they did not know how to live together in vulnerability. Vince never learned to shed the armor to enter the relationship as a whole person. Linda could not break through the walls he had built for too long. Two parallel people, coexisting, enduring together, but rarely meeting at the deepest emotional place. And in that prolonged silence, their marriage became a heartbreaking testament to the cost of power. It can keep everything standing firm, but it cannot make a relationship bloom when both have grown accustomed to living without truly touching each other. The relationship between Vince McMahon and his son, Shane McMahon, was not an explosive tragedy, but a long, exhausting wait, where a son always stood at the edge of the light, hoping that one day his father would see him as a true continuation. Shane grew up in a world where the McMahon name was both a privilege and a burden, where every step he took was cast under the enormous shadow of the most powerful man in wrestling. From very early on, Shane craved recognition, not because he was Vince's son, but because he wanted to prove he was worthy, that he was not just existing because of blood. But that very craving collided head-on with Vince's deepest fear, the fear of losing control. Vince looked at Shane not just with the eyes of a father, but through the lens of someone who had once been abandoned and had to seize power himself to survive. In his mind, handing over power did not mean trust. It meant putting himself in a vulnerable position. The more Shane expressed a desire to get involved deeper, to shoulder greater responsibility, the more guarded Vince became. He tested his son with heavy, sometimes dangerous tasks, but rarely gave him real decision-making authority. Shane was allowed to be present, but not to command. Allowed to prove endurance, but not to touch the center of power. In that arrangement, Shane was always in the state of close, but not quite enough, promised, but never fulfilled. For Shane, each passing year was a year of silent waiting. He entered WWE with the belief that if he worked harder, sacrificed more, his father would see him as a worthy successor. But Vince did not see those efforts the way Shane hoped. He saw in them the risk that if his son was good enough, independent enough, he himself could be pushed aside, a feeling he had sworn never to experience again. And so, while Shane waited for recognition, Vince unconsciously built more barriers, keeping power firmly in his own hands. The greatest tragedy lay in the fact that Vince did not intend to hurt his son, yet he reenacted his own childhood wound in that relationship. He had once been the unprotected child, the uncompensated child, and now, as a father, he unconsciously became the one unable to give the emotional safety he himself had never had. Shane grew up in a family that had material abundance, but lacked what he needed most, the feeling of being trusted. Vince loved his son in his own way, but it was a love tied to control, to challenge, to wariness. He did not know how to say, "You are good enough." because he himself had never heard those words. The times Shane left WWE and then returned were not impulsive. They were manifestations of an inescapable emotional cycle. He left when hope ran dry, returned when belief flickered back to life, then left again when he realized the door to power remained firmly shut. Each time, the distance between father and son did not narrow. It only became more vague, harder to name. Vince saw those departures as signs of inconsistency. Shane saw his father's silence as an unspoken rejection that would never be voiced. In this relationship, no one truly won. Shane carried the feeling of always having to wait, while Vince carried the fear that if he gave too much, he would lose everything. Those two fears collided, creating a void that neither dared to cross. Vince continued to hold power the way he had once held on to safety, while Shane continued to stand on the sidelines, both belonging and distant. It was a father-son tragedy without a clear climax, without a moment of final rupture, only the weary prolongation of things left unsaid. In the end, the relationship between Vince and Shane fully reflected the loop of unhealed wounds. A father who had once been abandoned unconsciously created the feeling of abandonment in his own child, not because he wanted to, but because he did not know any other way to survive. Shane grew up, matured, found his own path, but that sense of waiting never completely disappeared. It became part of who he was, just as the fear of being pushed aside became an inseparable part of Vince. And in that painful repetition, the McMahon family tragedy continued quietly, without end, silently proving that unnamed wounds can pass through generations, leaving gaps that even power cannot fill. The relationship between Vince McMahon and his daughter, Stephanie McMahon, took a different shape from the tragedy between him and Shane, but it was no less heavy, because there, family ties were bound so tightly to power that there was no escape. Stephanie grew up not just as a daughter, but as a preordained symbol, a part of the McMahon story that had to continue, a face representing the future of WWE in the eyes of the public. From very early on, she understood that she was not allowed to be just Stephanie, because the McMahon name carried expectations that no one ever asked if she was ready to bear. In Vince's world, where everything revolved around control and image, his daughter was both blood and an asset, symbolizing the continuation of power. Stephanie entered WWE with real talent, with intelligence and communication skills that quickly made her a familiar face to the public. But every step forward she took carried a paradox. The more she proved her worth, the deeper she was pulled into a role where the line between person and symbol grew increasingly blurred. Vince looked at Stephanie with pride, but also with the same wariness he showed toward anything capable of touching the center of power. He trusted his daughter more than his son, but that trust did not mean freedom. It came with heavy responsibility and constant oversight that never ended. Stephanie was not just representing the family, she was representing the empire, the image that Vince needed to maintain before the world. In that structure, a father's love could not exist separate from the politics of power. Every decision Stephanie made was scrutinized through the lens of benefit. Every personal choice carried strategic implications. She was both the daughter who wanted her father to see her as an independent person, and the high-level executive who had to follow the harsh logic of the organization. Conversations between father and daughter were rarely purely family matters. They were usually shrouded in work, image, and long-term calculations. Stephanie learned to survive in that space through flexibility, through the ability to balance emotion and role. But the price was that she gradually lost the right to live outside the gaze of power. Unlike Shane, who tried leaving and then returning, Stephanie chose to stay longer, to endure longer, because she believed that if she was patient enough, loyal enough, she could keep both the family and the position. But the longer she stayed, the more she realized that role had no endpoint, that she was trapped in a structure where any exit was seen as betrayal. Love in this context became complicated, because every gesture of care could be interpreted as a political move. Every difference of opinion carried the risk of turning into a power conflict. Stephanie not only had to prove her ability to the public, but also had to prove her loyalty within her own family. When Stephanie left WWE, it was not a loud declaration, not a public rebellion, but the quiet collapse of someone who had grown exhausted from living in a role she could not escape. It was the moment she chose to protect herself, to preserve the part of her humanity that power had eroded over many years. For Vince, that departure was not easy to name. It was not like the disappointment he had once felt with Shane, but more like a silent crack in the structure he believed was the most stable. His daughter, whom he had once seen as the symbol of continuation, had stepped out of that role not through confrontation, but through silence. This fracture did not play out in the press, with no public criticisms, but its weight lay in how it struck directly at Vince's deep belief that family and power could coexist in a closed structure. Stephanie's leaving served as a reminder that no one can live forever in a role designed by someone else's fear. For her, it was an act to reclaim herself. For Vince, it was one more painful proof that no matter how tightly he controlled, the people he loved could still slip out of the orbit he had drawn. In this tragedy, there was no betrayer, only people caught in a system that exceeded their capacity to bear. Stephanie loved her father, but could not continue living in a role that was both daughter and symbol. Vince loved his daughter, but did not know how to love without tying it to power and control. When their paths diverged, the collapse happened in silence. No one won, no one lost, leaving only an emptiness where family had been politicized for too long, to the point that it no longer recognized itself. When power and the relationships around him grew increasingly fragile, Vince McMahon began to rely on the one thing he believed he could control absolutely: his own body. For him, the body was not simply a means of living, but tangible proof of worth, of will, of the fact that he was still standing firm in a world where everything else could walk away. Vince trained with an intensity that even young athletes would approach with caution, not to get stronger, but to remind himself that he had not yet broken, that time had not yet taken away what he had fought his entire life to seize. The long training hours, the heavy lifts that exceeded safe limits, the conditioning sessions with no room for fatigue, became a daily ritual. His body ached, but that pain was familiar and far easier to control than the unease in his mind. When his muscles strained under the weight, Vince felt a clear kind of order. Pain was the result of effort, and effort brought strength. In that logic, suffering became evidence that he still had mastery over something. He did not believe in rest, because rest meant letting go, and letting go, for him, always took the shape of abandonment. The injuries did not come as sudden accidents, but as the inevitable consequence of pushing the body beyond every boundary. Torn ligaments, muscle strains, chronic back pain, all of it. Vince accepted with a cold indifference. He did not see them as signals to stop, but as challenges to overcome. Each time his body rebelled, he trained even harder, as if proving he could endure would keep him from facing the more terrifying question: if one day this body no longer obeyed, what would he have left? For Vince, accepting the limits of age was not maturity, but an unacceptable form of surrender. Old age came to him not as a natural progression, but as an enemy that needed to be defeated. The signs of time, the slowing down, the lingering pains were all viewed by him as direct threats to his sense of self-worth. Vince did not allow himself to grow old in his own imagination, because growing old meant becoming replaceable, sidelined, forgotten. The body, therefore, became the final battlefield where he fought that fear. He used physical strength to cover mental exhaustion, used the image of a still rugged man to deny the truth that inside he had been burned out for a very long time. In Vince's world, The body was not allowed to betray. It had to stand firm, had to endure, had to obey, just as he had forced himself to obey harsh principles since childhood. He treated himself with the same severity he had once endured, reenacting the cycle of violence in the form of extreme discipline. Every workout was not just physical training, but a silent declaration to the world and to himself. I am still here. I still have control. I have not yet broken. But that declaration was also an admission that if he lost the ability to control his body, he feared he would collapse completely. Those around him saw a Vince McMahon with an impressive physique, with rare endurance, and called it discipline, called it toughness. Few saw behind it a man using his body to compensate for the voids that power, family, and fame could not fill. Every hidden wound, every ignored pain, contributed to reinforcing the image of someone who would never submit. But it was that very image that pushed him further away from the ability to listen to himself, further from the warning signals that no one can win forever in the battle against time. The body became the final proof of Vince's worth, but also the mirror reflecting the deep contradiction within him. He used it to prove strength, while simultaneously binding himself to the fear that if that strength vanished, he would have no reason left to exist, as before. When everything else became uncertain, the body was what he clung to, even if it came at the cost of prolonged pain. And in that silent war, Vince McMahon kept moving forward, not because he felt no pain, but because for him, physical pain was far easier to endure than the prospect of having to admit that he was aging, weakening, and that one day he might have to let go with nothing left to prove just how strong he once was. The power that Vince McMahon once craved and seized with his entire life, by this stage, no longer took the shape of victory, but resembled a throne with no way down. He had stood at the very top for so long that he could no longer see any other path except to keep sitting there. Even though his legs were weary, his hands trembled, and his spirit had run dry. There was no true successor, no one he fully trusted, no structure that could exist independently without him. WWE operated, grew, and profited, but its center remained a single individual, and that individual did not know how to leave. Vince once believed that absolute power would bring absolute safety, but over time, that power turned into an increasingly heavy burden. No one was close enough to make the final decisions in his place, because he did not allow it to happen. No one was independent enough to stand in for him, because, deep down, he did not believe anyone else could hold on to what he had built. The idea of succession, for Vince, did not carry the color of continuation. It evoked the image of being replaced, pushed aside, made unnecessary, and that fear caused him to lock every possible door leading out. There was no escape, because Vince did not permit himself to imagine a life not tied to power. Rest was not a reward, but a threat. Leaving the central position was not a handover, but a form of disappearance. He had built himself so completely around the role of controller that he could no longer recognize himself without it. And so, even at an age when many choose to step back, Vince kept charging forward, not out of ambition, but out of fear of the void that would open if he stopped. The loneliness at the top did not come from a lack of people around him, but from the fact that no one could step into the space where every decision had to be borne by him alone. Vince lived amid a crowded organization, among thousands of employees, performers, and associates, yet there was no one to share the final burden. Every wrong decision could bring enormous consequences, and the fear of making a mistake made him cling even tighter to power. He did not dare give it away, because giving it away meant admitting he might no longer be necessary, and for someone who grew up haunted by the fear of abandonment, that was an unacceptable prospect. Power no longer brought a sense of control. It created a state of imprisonment. Vince was trapped in the very throne he had traded his whole life to climb. With each passing day, he had to keep proving he was still the only one who could keep this machine running, even as he himself felt the exhaustion growing ever clearer. He did not allow himself to weaken, did not allow himself to step back, because stepping back meant facing head-on the fear that had followed him since childhood. If I do not control, I will be abandoned. No rest, no stopping, no handover. Vince continued living in a closed loop. Power demanded constant presence, and that presence gradually eroded his ability to feel joy, satisfaction, or even meaning. Victories no longer brought pride. They only brought temporary relief that he was still there. Each time he overcame a crisis was not a moment to breathe easy, but a reminder that the next crisis would come, and he would again have to be the one to face it. In that space of absolute power, Vince had no other role to retreat into. Mr. McMahon had once been his hiding place, but by now, even that persona was not enough to conceal the exhaustion. Family had grown distant, children had chosen their own paths, and power became the only enduring relationship he still held. But it was a relationship that knew no rest, no mercy, no retreat. It demanded his presence every day, demanded proof every day, demanded continued control every day, no matter how high the mental cost grew. The peak loneliness of Vince McMahon did not lie in standing alone, but in having nowhere left to go. The throne he sat on had no staircase down, because he had demolished it long ago in fear of being replaced. And now, looking back, he faced a bitter paradox. The power once seen as an escape from the fear of abandonment had become the cage keeping him in place. He could not leave without losing himself, yet he could not continue without being eroded further each day. Vince was trapped in his own success, in a position with no clear end, no successor, no escape, no rest, only the continuation of a role he had fused so tightly with his own existence. And in that silence at the summit, the tragedy of power stood revealed. It can lift a person higher than anyone else, but it can also hold that person there forever, never allowing them to step down and become an ordinary human being, even for a single moment. The silence surrounding Vince McMahon did not arrive as a sudden moment, but accumulated gradually over many years, layer by layer, until it became the most dangerous thing in the room where every decision was made. When power has rested in one person's hands for too long, silence no longer signals respect. It becomes a manifestation of fear. No one dared say no. No one dared ask questions. No one dared set boundaries. And in that space, Vince no longer heard honest feedback, only the echo of his own voice. Absolute isolation did not happen because he wanted to be alone, but because the system around him had learned to eliminate all opposition. Those capable of pushback gradually left or were pushed away from the center of power. Those who stayed learned to nod, learned to stay silent, learned to avoid being the bearer of bad news. Vince grew accustomed to making decisions without challenge, and over time, he began to believe that was a sign of being right. But the cruel truth was, when no one says no, every decision risks drifting away from reality. The decisions grew increasingly distorted not because Vince had lost his mind or lacked ability, but because he no longer had any counterweight to calibrate them. Without opposing voices, his instincts for control and old fears guided him more strongly than reason. He believed he had to go further, harder, more aggressively to keep everything standing. But that very aggressiveness began to erode the values that had once helped him build the empire. Moral boundaries grew blurry, because no one was close enough to remind him those boundaries existed. The double life, once a survival mechanism, now began to rot from the inside. The public persona and the real person no longer supported each other. They started to collide. Mr. McMahon had once been a place to unload, but now it had become a mask glued so tightly that Vince struggled to distinguish what was performance and what was real choice. He continued to act as if he were untouchable, because that was the only image that helped him stand firm against the fear of abandonment. But inside, the prolonged tension had worn down his capacity for self-reflection, for self-correction, for stopping. Silence became dangerous because it nurtured the illusion of absolute control. Vince no longer heard early warnings, no longer sensed the signs of misalignment, no longer realized that the system he believed was solid was growing fragile due to the lack of honesty. Decisions came faster, harder, with less consideration, as if speed could compensate for the absence of pushback. And the faster he went, the further he drifted from the ability to look back. In that state, the loneliness reached another level. Not just the absence of someone to share with, but the absence of anyone who dared to intervene. Vince stood in the middle of a room full of people, yet there was no dialogue. Meetings became rituals where conclusions were already predetermined. Rare suggestions became roundabout, lacking directness. And, as everything ran on the inertia of power, small deviations began to accumulate into major risks. The double life rotted because it was no longer flexible. What had once helped Vince survive now locked him into a single role, where ruthlessness was legitimized, where vigilance became the default, where stopping was seen as weakness. He no longer had space to adjust, because adjustment required admitting he might be wrong. And, for someone who had tied his self-worth to never being pushed aside, admitting a mistake was far too dangerous a step. The collapse had not yet happened, but the signs were already present. Not loud, not public, just the feeling that the foundation was being hollowed out. Vince kept moving forward, not out of confidence, but because he saw no other choice in the way he understood existence. He had built a world where silence was rewarded, where loyalty was measured by obedience, and where pushback was seen as a threat. And in that world, the greatest danger was not an external enemy, but the quiet rot from within. When silence becomes the norm, danger does not need an explosion to take shape. It grows in the absence of dialogue, in the missing boundaries, in the belief that power can substitute for self-control. Vince McMahon entered this phase not intending to collapse, but with the belief that he still held everything in his hands. But that very belief, untested by any no, had placed him on a trajectory where even a small deviation could trigger irreversible consequences. What happened next did not resemble a dramatic collapse in the ring, but rather a slow draining of everything Vince McMahon had built to survive. The allegations emerged, carrying weight not only in the legal and media sense, but in a symbolic reversal. The man who once controlled the narrative no longer controlled the story about himself. For decades, Vince was the one who decided who got to speak, who got forgotten, who was the center, and who got pushed to the sidelines. This time, the story no longer belonged to him. It drifted along with the news cycle, with public judgment, with investigations and debates where he was no longer the director. Leaving WWE did not happen as a formal handover, much less a moment of liberation. It was a heavy separation, where power slipped from his hands faster than anything he had ever imagined. In an ecosystem he had tied himself to every link of. Stepping out, even if forced to, meant losing the language he knew best. No more boardrooms, no more final approvals, no more ability to shape the future of the machine he had nurtured with his entire life. WWE continued to operate, and that very fact became the deepest cut. The world he believed could not do without him kept moving forward. Losing power brought the loss of voice. No more defining statements, no more supreme decisions, no more ability to frame reality the way he once did. Vince, who had grown accustomed to speaking and being heard, now faced a different kind of silence. Not the silence born of others' fear, but the silence of no one waiting for him to speak. For a person who had built his identity around control, this silence took the shape of erasure. It was not loud, but persistent, and it forced him to look straight into the void that power had once covered. The allegations did not just attack his public image. They severed the connection between Vince and the role he saw as his very lifeblood. Mr. Sinister, McMahon, the persona that had once helped him stand firm against the booze, now offered no refuge. When the role was placed under the light of suspicion, the blurred line between stage and real life became a burden. He could no longer step back into the villain to control the story, because the story had moved beyond the ring. The double life, once a survival mechanism, now collapsed in the cruelest way. There was nowhere left to hide. The most painful part was not losing the title, but losing the feeling of being necessary. Vince had spent his entire life making sure he would never be abandoned, never become the one left on the sidelines. Yet when power left, he faced an undeniable reality. He truly had been left behind. Not in the sense that loved ones disappeared, but in the sense that his role in the world he had once shaped had ended. That feeling struck straight at the primal fear that had followed him since childhood. The fear of being pushed aside that he had sworn would never happen again. In the days that followed, everything familiar became strange. The rhythms that had once structured his life vanished, leaving a void without schedules, without final decisions, without strategies to pursue. For many people, that might have been an opportunity to rest. For Vince, it was an existential collision. He was not prepared to live without control, because his entire life had been built to avoid this very moment. When power was gone, the questions he had always postponed came crashing in. Who am I if I am not on the throne? Where does my worth lie if I no longer have the power to decide? The public debated, judged, concluded. Some saw the fall of an icon, others emphasized accountability and consequences, but beneath every interpretation lay one hard-to-deny psychological truth. A man who had tied his survival to power had that very thing taken away. And when that happened, no handover ritual was enough to soften the loss. Vince did not just leave WWE. He left the structure that had helped him stand firm against the fear of abandonment for decades. Losing power, losing voice, losing the ability to shape the story. These losses did not happen separately, but piled on one another, forming a total event. It forced him to confront what he had always avoided, his own fragility without the armor. No more stage to step into character, no more system to control, no more pace to cover emotions. Just one man and questions that had never been answered. The final tragedy was not that Vince McMahon lost everything in a single moment, but that he lost the very things that had helped him survive. The mechanisms that once protected him: power, control. The role left all at once, leaving him facing the old fear in its most naked form. A man who had spent his life making sure he would never be abandoned now had to learn how to exist in the feeling of being left behind. And it was in that very paradox that his story entered its most painful chapter. Nothing left to shield him, nothing left to control. Only the truth that power can build an entire life. But when it withdraws, it can also take away everything that once made a person believe they could never be replaced. When the crowd disperses, when the lights finally go out, Vince McMahon steps into a silence he has never learned to endure in his entire life. No more roles to hide behind, no more packed schedules to fill the time, no more people needing him to show up and decide anything. For the first time, not because he was challenged, but because there was no position left to stand in, he faces himself in stark silence. That is not the peace people dream of after leaving power, but a vacuum where every habit that once kept him upright disappears all at once. The passing days are no longer measured by meetings, flights, or final decisions. They drift by in empty spaces. Mornings have no goal to conquer. Evenings have no noise to drown out thoughts. For Vince, free time is not a reward. It is a prolonged interrogation. When no one needs him to speak, when no one waits for him to appear, the old question returns with unprecedented weight. Who am I when no one needs me? He once believed value lay in being necessary, that if the world needed him, he would never be abandoned. Now the world keeps running without him, and that belief crumbles in silence. No role means no more Mr. McMahon to shield him. On stage, he always knew exactly what to do, what to say, who to become. Off stage, when the role vanishes, he must face a person without a script. This emptiness does not come from lack of activity, but from lack of identity. He had fused himself so tightly with power and control that he no longer recognizes himself without them. When they leave, nothing immediately takes their place. Only memories, old fears, and a fatigue accumulated over decades remain. No schedule makes the days stretch unnaturally long. The disciplined habits that once helped him survive become meaningless when there is no purpose left to serve. He wakes up without knowing where to rush to, sits still without knowing what to control. That is the feeling of being left behind in his own life. No one chasing, no one waiting. For someone who once measured survival by the pace of work, this slowing down takes the shape of a fall. Not a fall from a great height, but a fall into emptiness, where there is nothing to hold on to. No one needs him. That sentence, when spoken aloud, sounds crueler than any accusation, because his whole life, Vince built everything to avoid exactly that feeling. He created systems, roles, power, all to ensure his presence was irreplaceable. But the present proves the opposite. Systems can continue, roles can change hands, power can be transferred. That truth needs no commentary. It exists in every quiet day, in every decision that no longer needs to be made. And it is in that silence that, for the first time, Vince is forced to face himself not as the controller, but as a human being. With no more survival mechanisms to escape into, he touches emotions that have been suppressed for too long. The fear of abandonment, nameless anger, unnamed sorrow. Childhood memories return not through the lens of control, but as raw, uncomfortable fragments. He realizes that, for many years, he used power to avoid this very conversation. Now, with nowhere left to run, the conversation begins. The emptiness is not nothingness. It is a space that forces a person to look directly. Vince sees the price of living without trusting anyone, of using control instead of trust, of using roles instead of connection. He does not have immediate answers, and perhaps there is no neat redemption. The only thing present is a hard-to-swallow truth. Strength cannot replace presence, and power cannot heal the fear of abandonment. The prolonged, silent days do not bring public forgiveness, nor instant relief, but they bring something Vince has never had. Time without having to prove anything. Time without having to control. Time to admit that he is tired. That is a strange experience, even frightening, because it forces him to relearn how to exist without relying on power. Not everyone survives that transition. Not everyone dares to stay still in silence long enough to hear themselves. Vince's present is not glorious, nor is it loud. It is empty in a way that forces confrontation. No roles, no schedules, no one needing him. These absences form a mirror. And in that mirror, he sees a person who was never allowed to be weak, never allowed to stop. For the first time, he stands before the possibility that value does not necessarily come from being needed, that existence might not have to be proven through power. The silence after the crowd is neither an ending nor a clear beginning. It is an in-between, where every layer of armor has fallen away, where the most important question is no longer what can I control, but how can I live with myself. And in that fragile in-between, Vince McMahon, for the first time, does not run away, not because he has won, but because there is nowhere else left to go. In the end, when every layer of shell has fallen away, when there is no more power to cling to, when there is no more role to hide behind, what remains in Vince McMahon is not redemption, nor is it complete forgiveness. There is no gentle moment of awakening, no peaceful conclusion like the stories people still want to believe. There is only a man who survived his entire life by splitting himself in two, and paid the price by never being allowed to be a whole human being. Vince did not collapse in the usual tragic way. He did not fall in front of the cameras, did not vanish from the world. He is still alive, still existing, still moving through each day. But that survival does not come from healing. It comes from a survival skill formed far too early, separating himself from the pain. As a child, he learned to detach emotion from body to endure violence. As an adult, he learned to detach his real self from the role to endure power. When he lost everything, he learned to detach memory from the present to keep surviving. Each such separation helped him endure one more stretch, but also took away a piece of his ability to live fully. There is no complete forgiveness, because some wounds cannot be neatly wrapped in apologies or belated regret. There is no peace, because peace requires fully facing and accepting oneself, something Vince was never permitted to do. He was not raised to feel. He was raised to endure. He was not taught to trust. He was taught to control. He was not told that he had value for being himself, but for what he held in his hands. And when those things vanished, the part of him that was never nurtured could not simply appear. Vince McMahon is not simply a villain, nor is he purely a victim. He is the product of unhealed wounds, of a world where strength is seen as the condition for survival. He built an empire not just to dominate, but to make sure he would never be abandoned. He controlled everything, not just out of ambition, but out of a deep fear that if he let go, he would become the unprotected child again. But that very fear led him too far, to the point where power became his ego, and ego became his prison. In the remaining part of his life, Vince does not step into redeeming light, nor does he sink fully into darkness. He exists in a prolonged gray zone where memories, lost power, and a hazy identity overlap. He is no longer the most powerful man in wrestling, but he also does not become an ordinary person who finds peace. He is a survivor, not because he has healed, but because he learned how not to feel fully, and that is the deepest tragedy, living long enough to look back, but not free enough inside to truly come home. This story does not close with easy judgment. It leaves behind a heavy question for the audience, especially for America, where power, success, and self-made are often celebrated as the ultimate ideal. Vince McMahon is proof of an uncomfortable truth. Power can help you survive, but it cannot help you heal. Success can cover wounds, but it cannot make them disappear. Control can keep you standing before the world, but it cannot help you stand firm before yourself. A man can build an entire empire with will and fear, but if there is no place to lay down the pain, that empire will never become a home. Vince survived by splitting himself in two, one half controlling, one half enduring, and the price was never being able to live as a whole person. Not every life has a beautiful ending, but some lives, when looked at directly, force us to ask ourselves, are we living to win, or are we living to be ourselves? And that is the saddest, but also the most honest, legacy this story leaves behind. Looking back at the entire story of Vince McMahon, the lingering emotion is not judgment or defense, but a deep and persistent sadness for a man who had to live his entire life in a state of defense. From a childhood of abuse and no protection, Vince learned to survive through control. From the moment he bought the company from his father, not to inherit, but to not be pushed aside, he confirmed that the fear of abandonment was the core driver of his entire life. WrestleMania, WWE's global expansion, the birth of the Mr. McMahon persona, all of it was not simply ambition, but additional layers of armor he wore to shield the child who had never been safe. The greatest tragedy lies in the fact that the very mechanisms that once helped him survive gradually destroyed his capacity to heal. Marriage ran on duty instead of sharing. The father-son relationship with Shane repeated the wound of rejection. Stephanie was pulled into a symbolic role until family ties were politicized. When power reached its peak, silence became dangerous. No one dared say no. Distorted decisions accumulated. And finally came the fall allegations, leaving WWE losing his voice. The man who once feared abandonment was truly left behind in the silence after the crowd. The lesson for Americans people raised on the ideal of self-made success is an uncomfortable but necessary truth. Power and success can help you survive, but they cannot help you heal. Extreme discipline over the body, absolute control in work, or public personas cannot replace emotional safety, relationships with boundaries, and honest dialogue. Honoring Vince does not mean denying his mistakes, but looking straight at the cost of surviving by splitting oneself in two, to remind us that a strong society does not just produce winners, but must also teach people how to stay with themselves without needing armor. If you value the real stories behind power, where people pay a price to survive, please hit subscribe to the channel to continue joining us on these untold journeys. Thank you for listening to the end, and see you in the next video, where another story will keep reminding us that the greatest strength is sometimes daring to face yourself.